evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is Marcia Eli, and on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, and the Center for Brooklyn History, which is where we are, I have the joy of greeting you tonight and telling you a little bit about what we're going to do and who we are. I'll just start by asking, how many of you have actually been to the Center for Brooklyn History before in any incarnation? Oh, fantastic. So you probably know that we reopened just last September as the Center for Brooklyn History of the Brooklyn Public Library, reinvigorated with a lot of sort of new visions for how this space will be used. We're a place of collections, we're a place of research, we're a place of scholarship, we're a place of education, and we're a place of public programs like this one. And I hope that if you aren't already getting our emails every week that tells you what's coming up and shares our blog, that you go to the Center for Brooklyn History website and sign up for them so you can hear about the upcoming events. Tomorrow, for instance, we have the first in a series related to the exhibition that you saw projected on the wall here called Brooklyn Is, and all around us here. It's called Inspired by Brooklyn, and it's the first of a few programs of music and documentary films inspired by Brooklyn, about Brooklyn neighborhoods. We will get down the road in April, have programs about democracy and its slippage towards fascism with Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is a internationally renowned expert on fascism. Stephen Hahn, who wrote a book called Illiberal America, talking about traditions that we think are new, but he talks and convinces us that they aren't new in this country, this democratic country, moderated by Michael Waldman from the Brennan Center. So there are a lot of things coming up, and I especially want to point out the one that's coming up at the Central Branch on March 16th, and it is going to be like nothing you've ever experienced before. Night in the Library Out of Darkness will be a 7 p.m. to 2 a.m. experience with dozens of programs relating to that theme, performances, music, talks, food, drink, and I hope that you'll consider joining us for that. So tonight, we are going to be exploring identical twin photographers, Frances and Kathryn McLaughlin, or Franny and Fuffy, who broke barriers during the golden age of magazines, whose stories had been buried until Carol Kino wrote the book that just came out called Double Click. And we're really excited to have Carol here tonight to tell us a little bit about the story that she's found about these two extraordinary women in conversation with Laura Raicovich. They will join up here in a second, but I just want to tell you a little bit about how the evening will go. Carol's going to give a little bit of an overview here, then sit and talk for a bit with Laura. Then there'll be a chance for you to ask your questions, and then I hope you'll join us for a book signing. As you probably saw as you came in, the book is at our shop. A little bubbly, Prosecco or water, and linger and talk. So. Now I have the pleasure of telling you a little more formally about Carol and Laura. Carol Kino writes about art, artists, the art world, and contemporary culture. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Atlantic, Slate, Town and Country, and just about every major art magazine. She was formerly a fellow at the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center at the New York Public Library and the USC Annenberg Getty Arts Journalism Program. Double Click is her first book. And Laura Raicovich is a New York City-based writer and curator. She has written and edited numerous books, including, most recently, Culture Strike, Art and Museums in an Age of Protest, which is being translated into Arabic, Portuguese, and Italian. She is editor and curator of Photo Dispatch, a digital publication featuring artists' takes on the local and global conditions that make their work necessary. And along with others, and I love this, she recently opened the Francis Kite Club, a bar slash cultural slash activist space in New York City's East Village. From 2015 to 2018, Laura was director of the Queens Museum. So please help me welcome Carol and Laura to the stage.
Hi, I'm going to present a little PowerPoint that will give you a taste of the twins' work. My book is about a pair of identical twin photographers who started their careers in New York just before America entered World War II. Their bylines were Frances McLaughlin-Gill and Kathryn Abbe, but they were known as Franny and Fuffy. Franny was the only woman photographer on the staff of the Condé Nast photo studio, working primarily for Vogue and Glamour. And Fuffy freelanced very successfully for all the smart career girl magazines that flourished in the 1940s, like Mademoiselle and Charm. They started out in a time when the concept of careers for young women was in the air, and this was given a boost by the war. As the men disappeared, there was suddenly a lot of opportunity for young women who wanted to work. So in my book, I use this slice of the twins' early careers to examine the lives of women during this period, and also to look at magazine photography, which essentially came of age during this moment too. So here's a quick visual tour through their world. They were born in 1919 in Brooklyn, near Ebbets Field, relatively near here. Their father died a few months after they were born, during the tail end of the Spanish flu pandemic. When they were about 4, their mother moved to Wallingford, Connecticut, a small factory town outside New Haven where she had family. And on the right, that's them in Wallingford. On the left, they're in Brooklyn. The twins were photographed constantly while growing up. They had an aunt who was camera crazy, or a Kodak fiend in the parlance of the times. And people were surprisingly crazy about their cameras then, much as we are about our smartphones today. So that's Franny on the left striking a pose, and Fuffy on the right with the camera. This is them at high school graduation. I think they're reversed in this picture, I think that's Fuffy on the left and Franny on the right. Junior clothes weren't really a thing at this stage, so the twins designed and crocheted their own clothes for this picture. They were tremendous students, always at the top of their class, separated by a fraction of a point, and their achievements were often in the papers. They traded position all the way through school, with one of them being top and the other being top the next year. When they graduated, it just so happened that Franny was at the top, so she was valedictorian and Fuffy was salutatorian. And this news made many of the papers in Connecticut. It made the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, because they were still Brooklyn kids, perceived as being Brooklyn kids, and it also made the New York Times. They returned to Brooklyn to go to art school at Pratt, which was one of the few schools in the US to have a fully equipped photo lab. This is a picture of it in the graphic arts magazine, PM, which devoted an entire issue to Pratt's School of Fine and Applied Arts in 1937, the year the twins started. The twins were really great to write about because they had this uncanny ability to appear on the scene just as something really historically important was going on. And that was the case with Pratt. So photography wasn't really a course of study there. Pratt set up the lab because it had become so important to illustration. but it had to earn its keep. It provided photographic services to the school, yearbook shots, faculty portraits, lantern slides for art history lectures, anything that was needed. Only a small group of kids were allowed lab privileges, among them the twins. They got hooked and decided that's what they wanted to do. And this is one of the twins, we're not sure which one, taking a picture of their photo teacher, Walter Savardi. Presumably the picture was taken by the other twin. I was going to show you pictures of the men they eventually married, who were both very well-known Harper's Bazaar photographers, and the pictures they took of the twins. But what I think is so interesting about the twins is that although they modeled briefly, once they became photographers, that is what they did. They did not mess around with being models or muses, which makes them completely different to some beautiful women whose photographic careers are of interest to us today, like Lee Miller or maybe Dora Maar. Similarly, although they were very interested in art, and they both studied art outside of Pratt, with Yasu, as many students did, with Yasu Kuniyoshi, one of the city's most popular painting teachers. And Franny also studied with Reginald Marsh, who was one of the most famous painters in New York. They did not think about being artists. They really fell in love with photography. And they also knew they had to go to work. They were very bohemian, but they didn't have the leisure to mess around with being bohemian in their work. Their mother had lost most of her money during the crash, and like many people coming out of the Depression, their constant refrain in every interview was, "We had to work." So I'm just going to cut to their work. Soon after they got out of school, Franny was somewhat unexpectedly hired by Alexander Lieberman to be the lone woman photographer in the Condé Nast studio. He was a refugee. He had just become art director of Vogue. He was assembling a group of new young Americans whom he was molding to shape a kind of American vision. She was his second hire for the studio after Irving Penn. She was essentially put on the emerging junior and career girl beat. And this is an early shot for Vogue's junior section, which ran in 1944 when she'd been in the job for about a year. This is another from 1946, 1946, and the top picture is the one that ran. The bottom is the outtake shot on 3rd Avenue, which was a favorite location for her, taking photos. I think it looks completely contemporary. After the war, when film was more plentiful, all of the young Americans were expected to experiment. During the war, they shot entire shoots with 3 or 4 frames of film. I believe this is one of Franny's experiments with a new young model, Carmen Del Arefice, who was 14. There are lots of these photos with Carmen in different outfits, expressing different attitudes, recalling different eras and styles in photography. They were never published, so far as I can see. The men's experiments often were published and hers weren't, so make of that what you will. This is for Glamour from 1947, the year everything changed dramatically and young women were expected to stop working, or at least to find a husband, get married, have children, and then stop working. It's from a series on the career bride who gets married in a suit. After a while, they let the powers that be at Condé Nast let Franny cover Real Fashion. This is her second Vogue cover in 1949. Dior New York, his ready-to-wear line, and it also happens to be the first Dior photo Vogue ran on the cover. In 1952, Vogue sent her to cover the Paris collections. This was the first time they sent a woman. This part of the shoot took place in the Chateau of Versailles. It seems to have been the first time that the government allowed a magazine shoot to take place there. So she also has that distinction of being the first photographer to do a magazine shoot in the Chateau. So now we're back to Fuffy. When Franny was hired by Condé Nast, it really lit a fire under her twin. She had a great job at the time. She was working as the assistant to Tony Furcell, who was one of the most famous photographers in America. She was Vogue's top woman photographer. The distinction is that Tony was on contract, and Franny was hired by the studio as a staff photographer. She could only work for Condé Nast. Anyway, when Franny was hired by the studio, Fuffy couldn't take the idea of being an assistant and being inferior to her twin. So she quit to go out on her own as a photographer. Within a year, she was doing about 2/3 of the photos in Charm, which was a glamour competitor. This is an accessory shot from 1945, and it gives you an idea of how stylistically it was anything goes in these magazines, and the photographers often got to decide how they were going to style the shoots. After the war, travel really eased up, and photographers were sent out on location a lot. She traveled much more than her sister did, because her sister was often in the studio or in New York City or environs. So here she is in Cuba in 1946. There are often a lot of filmic references in her work. This is in California, also in 1946. And the fashion editor of Charm had come from Glamour and had previously been a photographer herself. And there were, at the time she was at Glamour, there were 3 Glamour fashion editors, and 2 of them became photographers, and 1 had been a photographer, which I think is really interesting. This is California again. Soon after the war, Fuffy and her husband went to Paris and visited the studio of the surrealist Leonore Fini. This is a shot taken around New Year's 1947 to 48. This is another photo of the famous model Carmen del Arefice, who lived down the block from Fuffy and her husband in Manhattan. She was by now a very famous model. This is around 1949. This is a picture taken by Franny the following year of Fuffy with her children and her stepson after they'd moved out to Long Island. So all this glamour it wasn't completely past, but she was becoming a housewife. The Abbeys used it for a Christmas card, and it was later repurposed by Glamour for a story on mothers who were able to juggle children and work. So that was really the name of the game for women after the war. When the men came home, many women did give up their careers, but the twins never did. So I think now Laura is going to ask me some penetrating questions.
Do you want to sit down and we can relax? Thank you, Carol. That was really a whirlwind tour. So this is the book, and it's really wonderful. I was privileged to read it in manuscript form and then to get to read it as well now that it's out in its beautiful hardback. And you know, just hearing you go through that 10 minutes synopsis made me kind of yearn for certain details in the book that we'll get into. But I guess I want to start with how you came across the twin story. What made you decide to?
Yes, it's working.
What made you decide to take them on as a research subject? You know, how did you find them?
Well, I have a friend who is a publicist for a lot of galleries that handle photography, and at some point she came to me and said, I have a story for you. And it was about Franny. Well, it was sort of shifting at the time. There was going to be a show. It might have been Franny and her husband, who was a great Harper's Bazaar photographer. It might have involved, there was a twin sister somewhere in there. Anyway, it ended up being about Franny and her husband, and I wrote, and their associates, and I ended up writing a 2 stories about them, and got really interested. And then at the opening of the show, I got completely intrigued by this small adjacent room filled with family photos that all of these photographers had taken of each other, and that sort of started. But I was also at a point where many stories I wrote, I saw a book in them and just didn't really know what to do about it. So that sort of started it, I would say.
I mean, I think from where I sit, where I have been engaged in a research project these last several years that began during the pandemic about an exhibition from 1943 that was organized by Peggy Guggenheim that featured all women artists, called Exhibition by 31 Women. And what's interesting to me about the story that you tell through the lives of the twins is this particular moment in time that I think bears a really interesting relationship to our own. You know, women being pulled into the workforce because of the war. A lot of displaced people were moving through New York City at the time. Many people were fleeing the violence of Europe, becoming editors of fashion magazines, as was the case with some of the 31 women. Many of them were already practicing artists before the war, but coming to New York, they ended up actually working in the magazines, either as illustrators before photography really hit it, or also in the theater. They designed costumes for the ballet, they designed sets for the ballet and for theater. And so there's something to me that's super intriguing about the sketch that you make of their lives, because I think, in a sense, the moment that they hit the magazines, they go to Pratt and then they hit the magazines, is really a moment that is full of possibility in spite of the fact that the world seems to be falling apart.
Yeah. Well, it was a fascinating cultural time because I think high and low were much more mixed than they are today. There wasn't a distinction between them. Partly it was the Depression and everybody needed to work. And I think women were moving into the workforce, at least in cities, before the war. The types of young women had been moving into the workforce during the Depression because people really needed to work. That was I think I said.
Yeah, if they could find jobs, right?
Yeah, they really did need to work, but they also had a need to work. They had a personal need to work. That they had a personal desire to work. As times got better, they could have easily gotten married and found husbands who would have helped support their mother, but they didn't want to do that. But one of the things that appealed to me so much about that period was it was this fascinating period where a lot of different influences were coming together to create this idea of what is America. And that had been happening before the war as American artists who hadn't necessarily been born in America, but a lot of different people were trying to create this idea of what is American art. Then there was this idea of what is American photography. And then during the war, as more and more refugees came in, this happened even more intensely. So all these people were embarked on this weird common goal.
Yeah,
I would say.
And I think there's something interesting that that definition emerges at the same time that there is this kind of feminism in the air, or multiple feminisms, I should say, of not only women being in the workforce, but actually contributing to the war effort in really significant ways, that these were ways of domestically kind of fighting in the war. And again, you know, this somewhat nationalist theme of like what defines the United States. And I think a piece of that comes out in this kind of early obsession with photography and kind of the new technology of photography being made small, being made portable, being made accessible to people financially. You know, cameras, this was the first moment in time that cameras were something that were relatively affordable, right? How did the twins get involved in photography? Like you mentioned their aunt, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about
how they personally got involved.
How they personally got involved with photography.
They were always. Do you mean at Pratt or at?
Yeah, before Pratt as the kids, but then also going into Pratt, because I think it was a very specific decision that they both made to go into photography specifically.
Yeah, they were always photographed as children, and photography. I forget when the brownie was introduced. I think it was 1900 or 1901.
And the Brownie's a camera.
Yes, the Brownie, the camera, was introduced. Yes, sorry. Not the Brownie, the little girl Brownie.
Or the dessert.
I forgot about that. So Brownies really made cameras accessible to...
Was that coincident with the World's Fair in '39?
Oh, no, the Brownie was
before
like
that.
1900
Okay,
or 1901.
got it.
I forget the exact date, but it made it possible for people to take photos of their children by themselves rather than hiring a portrait photographer. It made it possible for soldiers at the front to take pictures of, I don't know, the war going on around them. I don't know what they would have been taking pictures of, but it made it really easy for people to cheaply buy a camera and take pictures of the world around them. It really expanded personal photography. And so the twins had, the twins were very picturesque and were constantly the subject of photography, and they had an aunt who was camera mad, as I think I said that in the introduction.
And did she lend them her camera?
She did, but they talked a lot about how exciting it was to go to the drugstore and pick up the films, the developed film every week and see what it looked like. I mean, I would imagine they weren't the only children having that experience.
So they had their own camera?
Yes.
And did they?
Oh, no, they got their own camera for high school graduation, and she gave them a very expensive camera as a graduation present because she was such a camera nut. And then but I was so amazed during my research that even during the Depression, people were able to, some people had enough disposable income that you could open a camera store and it would be a really reliable source of income.
That's so interesting.
It was just amazing to me that cameras sold really well during the Depression. It was something that was just a stunning piece. I mean, like during the pandemic, there were still people who were buying things, and clearly there were people buying things during the Depression, and one of the things they bought were cameras. Yeah.
So interesting.
So interesting. So they went, and then this interest in photography just spread during sort of the tail end of the Depression. There were all these magazines like Life starting, and that had already been going on in Europe with these pictorial magazines spreading all over Europe in a big way, and then it came to America in the mid-30s, and then regular magazines started replacing
fashion illustration.
Yes, and just illustration in general with photographs. And by the time the twins got to Pratt was very, I think there's a lot more research to be done in what Pratt was doing, and in terms of photography and how advanced they were in this. But they had started building a photography lab really early. They were really on it much more than other schools. And what was it
like for the twins to decide to do photography?
They don't really say why they were so. I guess they'd always been. They'd always been artists. They'd always painted in school and had modeled clay in school. They did the first photograph on the cover of their high school magazine, which was really boundary breaking at the time.
Do you think that they wanted to produce photographs because it was something creative, a way to creatively channel their energies while also earning a living? Do you think that was part of their...
I think people who were into photography then were really... They were different from painters, although a lot of painters were using photography. I think it was people who were interested in science, and it really took different skills from painting.
Because it was sort of geeky, like in a tech way. Like you had to know how to
and
use
it's really
the dark
hard to
room
use. I've tried using those cameras, and it really takes a lot of hand-eye coordination. It takes very different skills from painting. It's because you have to move backwards, or you're moving very counterintuitively. It's like playing a sport, and they often do talk about it's like playing tennis. I mean, it's a very physical kind of thing. It's so interesting. So I think they just got the bug for it, and it probably was something you could earn money from, and it was practical.
Yeah, and I guess they
Perhaps.
also saw all these magazines suddenly taking over,
Yeah,
using
yes,
photography,
yes.
and
And
so
it
that was a way
it was
through
new,
Pratt.
It was scientific. It was like
Yeah.
the latest thing.
Oh.
It was really, it was something if you were young and really into the
Next
new,
big thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of Pratt, I mean, let's talk a little bit about your research. Where did you concentrate your research, and
Well,
and how did that go? Like, did you have to really dig? Like, how buried
Well,
were their stories?
I happened onto this subject that nobody had done a lot of research on, which was really painful. So I went to Pratt and said, "Tell me how your photo department started." And they said, "Well, you're welcome to go through all of our catalogs and the faculty minutes and so like nobody knew, and the photo scholars I called in desperations said, "Oh, that's interesting. Nobody's done any research into Pratt. What an interesting subject." So I did it.
Wow, so you read the minutes of the meetings where they formed the photography department?
Yes,
Wow.
I scanned them with my iPhone, then OCR'd them because the scanning programs weren't automatically OCRing.
What's OCR?
Was, turning them into text. I went through every issue of the school newspaper from, I think the newspaper started as they got to the school. It's an extremely
So what
good
year was that
newspaper.
again? Sorry.
37.
37.
I think maybe it started partway through. I don't completely remember.
So it was like the late 30s. So that's when the photo department was being established, was when they were there. So it was something new, shiny, and glossy
Yes.
that they could
Yes.
sink their teeth into.
Yeah.
Do you think that they saw their work as art?
I think they were thinking about art, but it never occurred to them that anyone else would see it as art. But I think they were thinking about art all the time. I think they were terribly interested in art, and a lot of their teachers, there was art in many of their pictures. A lot of their teachers were collecting. I mean, that's where this boundary between, is it art, what is it? A lot of their teachers and people they admired were collecting early American furniture and folk art. I forget what it was called then. It had some name like naive art, but like Shaker furniture, early American painting. It had some weird name that sounds kind of insulting
now. It's on the tip of
now.
my tongue, too. But yes, we would call it, or outsider art.
Well, it's folk art, essentially. But so a lot of sophisticated modernists were collecting this sort of work, because if you were an artist, it was very cheap. Nobody really wanted it. And it was kind of a great thing to collect. But it wasn't really in galleries yet. So, and the men they married were also collecting this stuff and using it to prop their paintings or prop their photographs, using it to put in the background. And the twins were doing this too. So it was this very sophisticated group of people who were kind of at the edge of something that was about to happen. So they were aesthetically really sophisticated and had very sophisticated eyes, and they were friends with all of these people who were experimental photographers, like Erwin Blumenfeld was a very close friend of both twins, and they were looking at things they were doing in their studios and were influenced by
and
that.
I mean, I'm not sure. I don't much care for the discussion of whether or not it's art. I just wondered if they
I think they were always thinking about art, and they were always looking at paintings, and they were always looking at all sorts of things.
Well, and I also think another signature of the time was that there was a lot more blending of different types of art form in singular settings. I mean, we were talking the other day about how, at Julian Levy Gallery, there were Disney cells that were mixed into fine art what others would call fine art exhibitions.
We should say who Julian Levy is, though, because he was one of the first dealers maybe the first dealer of, one of the first dealers of surrealism, but he also was one of the first dealers of photography. And there were shows in his gallery that would have, so he, what's her name? Diego Rivera's wife. How can I forget?
Oh my God, Frida Kahlo, for
Frida
God's
Kahlo,
sake.
right. What a sexist thing for me to say, Diego Rivera's wife. But anyway, so he was the first person to show her, the first person to show
I
many.
think he was the first person also. I mean, there's a lot of overlap at Julian Levy Gallery with some of the 31 women as well.
Right.
I think he was the first person to show the surrealists, including Leonora Feeney. I mean, not Leonora Feeney, Leonora Carrington.
Yeah.
I think he was the first to show her.
Leonora
and of
Feeney.
course, Julian Levy also organized these really epic chess tournaments at the gallery, in sort of the back room at the gallery, and like Duchamp, and there are pictures of like Leonora Carrington playing with Max Ernst, and anyway, they're sort of fabulous.
Yeah.
But it was definitely part of this milieu, and so the twins were definitely a piece of that, no?
Yeah, well, I'm sure they went to his gallery when they were in school, and he would have things like shows with costumes, like Disney gels, or drawings for Disney cartoons, and then costumes for a ballet that had been ordered from a Sears catalog, and paintings by a surrealist, and it would all be jumbled together. And he showed Gracie, George Burns and Gracie Allen. Gracie Allen was a painter for a while, so he showed her paintings, and he showed this great melange of stuff.
Yeah,
and
so
that was sort of what was going on during this period, which is really thrilling.
Yeah.
With no hierarchies and no.
And it was quite, I think, intentional, and sometimes actually very helpful for publicity around the show. Because, like, for example, with the 31 Women exhibition from 1943 that I've been looking at, Peggy Guggenheim included Gypsy Rose Lee, the stripper / cabaret star, and she was a mega star, and she also made art. I mean, she made collages and paintings and other things. And in fact, interesting side note, which I just thought was very cool, was that when I was researching what artwork of hers was in the 31 Women show, it was nearly impossible to locate because there weren't photographs typically taken of exhibitions at the time, and so there was just a unillustrated checklist. And so as I was trying to figure out what her work could possibly have looked like, there was sort of mention in a bunch of the reviews about a kind of collage, assemblage type of work. And somebody showed me a photograph of her by Erwin Blumenfeld. And on the wall behind the portrait of her was the work by her that I think was in the show, that I only recognized through one of the descriptions in the reviews. So anyway, there's an interesting relationship to Blumenfeld, who of course was photographing many, many artists at the time, and he had a very particular way of photographing artists. And I think that, from what you write in the book, that Franny and Fuffy certainly knew his work, and oftentimes,
Blumenfeld?
Yeah.
Oh, they knew him. He was
they
at
knew
Franny's
him very
wedding.
well, right?
Yeah, he was at Franny's wedding.
Yeah, so I mean, in the sense that there's this kind of network of artists and creative people, in the hive of New York City's creative zones at that moment in time, I think they seem to be very much a part of it.
Yeah.
What was their relationship, say, to kind of the superstars of that came out of that era, like Irving Penn and Richard Avedon?
I don't think they were that. They knew Avedon, but he was a little younger. He started a little bit after they did, but they knew him. I think he shared Fuffy's husband's studio for a while, but. They were very close to Irving Penn. So Irving and Franny started in the Condé Nast studio at about the same time, and they seemed to have dated or were involved for a while. So there was this sort of, they all like, it seems to have been like La Ronde. They all dated interchangeably, sometimes in, the twins dated.
Well, the twins like to confuse people, right?
Yeah. Not always with dating. I think they didn't confuse men they were going out with, but they confused their teachers sometimes. But they both dated the same man for a while at the same time, and he married one of them. And but there was a lot of. I didn't put all of it in the book because I couldn't substantiate it adequately. But there was a lot of dating that went on in this circle of friends, and then they all ended up married to various people within that group, and they all remained friends. I mean, it was all very amicable, I think. So,
yeah, I think it was, I don't know, from my sense of the kind of liaisons that happened amongst the 31 women and people in that circle, it was much more laissez-faire.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't as, I feel like, the current moment may be a little bit more conservative.
I don't think people
was.
hashed over their relationships then, it seems to me. I think they just had them, is my sense of it. They were just living their lives with. Well, that's the interesting thing, because analysis was, people were getting into analysis then. But I don't know if they, it seemed to me like they weren't discussing their relationships with each other, just with their analysts, which is so interesting. It was just reserved for the psychiatrist, but not for interpersonal discussion, which maybe, I don't know if that's better.
I don't know. That's an interesting way of looking at your
but there was a lot
therapy session.
There was a lot of interest in analysis starting then. So one of the husbands was in analysis the entire time, and that was like a big deal.
And it was also somewhat confusing, right? Because his analyst became extremely involved in his life.
Yes.
I mean, she even vetted
a whole lot of people's
Franny.
lives. Yes. No, Fuffy. She
Fuffy,
vetted Fuffy, yeah. I think Franny was too sensible to
tolerate that.
Yes, exactly.
So while we're on the subject of getting the twins confused, while we often talk about them as the twins or somewhat, the interchangeability of them, can you talk a little bit about how you dealt with that in writing the book? Because I think they have very distinctive personalities and they chose very different career paths at the end of the day. And so, how did, as the research was unfolding, how did you kind of catch yourself from being too summary about them and kind of showing them for each of their individual?
It was really difficult because, one wants to deal with them equally in the book, and their careers were so different from each other, and their careers weren't precisely equal by any stretch of the imagination. And it was really hard to figure out how to give them both equal time and also how to draw the distinctions between them, because I think one of them was more into them being twins. Fuffy was more into them dressing alike and being twinny, and Franny was more striking out for her independence all the way through. And it was just, and it was also very hard to figure out. It's almost in retrospect that I realize how they handled their relationship when they were talking about each other. And I was kind of bamboozled by them for a lot of it.
Talk about that more. That's so interesting.
I mean, it is interesting. So to me, it's interesting because I'm still thinking about it. So, they had this very confusing relationship with the man that Fuffy married, and for a long time. And she would always say, "Oh yes, we were together from the moment we met. We were just always, we were so in love." She would go on about that. When I met my husband in 1942, we were, and Franny would never contradict her. But Franny would contradict her when she said, "Oh yes, we were still using 2 cameras in that we were still using one camera. She would say, no, we were not. I was working for Condé Nast, and I had plenty of cameras. So after a while, I realized, I reported all of this stuff down to the ground. So, because it did not seem that Pfuffy had really gotten together with her husband in 1942. It seemed like there was this menage kind of thing going on much longer than that.
Yeah, there was a period where basically Pfuffy's husband, before he became Pfuffy's husband, was seeing both of them and kind of deciding between the two,
kind of with her, but not fully
not
decided.
Committed, and then would take Franny out too.
Yeah. And it was,
and maybe other women. I don't know.
No,
I think the two of them.
I think it was them, but it was kind of woolly.
That makes it even kind of weirder.
Yeah. Better, maybe. I don't know.
Makes for a better story.
But after a while, I realized, I think the professional stuff, Franny was always going to challenge her on, because that's where it was professional. But the family, the personal stuff, she was just going to let her.
She could rewrite that. So in other words, Franny was okay with Pfuffy kind of leaving
prattling
the soft edges soft on some of the personal histories, but on the work stuff.
But there was a lot of stuff that Pfuffy would prattle about, like, oh yeah, we bought the house together in 1943 and it was so wonderful. And I tracked down all those records. He bought the house, and it wasn't in her name till the 1970s. So,
right.
like, that is not true.
So there's a bit of revisionism.
Yeah, and everybody kind of let her do it. I mean, like you do in a family, right? So
yeah.
But it was so It was so confusing. It was really difficult to parse that out.
So how would you characterize Franny's personality vis-a-vis Pfuffy?
Well, I've heard it from many people too, although the really interesting thing is, like, they had their fans. So some people say, Pfuffy was the warm one, and, Franny was not, and it'll be vice versa, with other people. Franny was self-contained, self-sufficient, and pretty tart, I think. And Pfuffy needed other people, to shine in other people's reflection, I think.
So it's interesting
that's
that you
the shorthand version.
But it's interesting that you say that, given what happened to each of them after the war and the way that their careers shifted and their in concert with their personal lives.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about what happened to both of them after the war ended, and men were re-entering the workforce in very large numbers, and including photographers.
They had remarkably long-lasting careers. I mean, they did not back down at all. Franny, the Condé Nast twin, stayed in the studio till the studio closed, and then she was on contract with Condé Nast for another 20 years. And what edged her out of the studio was when Diana Vreeland took over Vogue, and they just didn't see eye to eye on fashion photography. So she never shot fashion for Vogue after that. But I think she remained on contract with them. She just wasn't shooting fashion. And then Pfuffy had 4 years where she was bringing up children, and had to stop taking assignments, but she kept on taking photographs. She just kept ye old Hasselblad, as she said, around her neck all the time. She just kept on taking pictures, and then she realized, I have these great photos of my children and my friends with their children, and I can market these. So she was like just always thinking, where can I sell my photos? And then she developed this really successful career as a children's photographer, or a photographer of children. And I think she made tons of money doing it. And, we downgrade the idea of children's photography, but she was a really good children's photographer. And it's debatable which one of them was, oh, that's her son. That's her son Eli, who lives like 10 minutes away from where I grew up, and is he wrote Intuit QuickBooks, so he's doing pretty well.
Well, and I think the twins are obviously characters in and of themselves, but there were also so many other people in the book who, in their lives also, who were characters also. Really eccentric people who found their way into the magazine world.
Oh God, they were such fantastic characters.
Yeah, maybe you can talk about a couple of them, because I think it's a really beautiful thread in the book.
Oh God, where would I start?
I don't know.
Is
Who's
there
your
anyone
favorite?
who appealed to you?
Well, let's start with their husbands first of all.
Okay, their husbands. So Jimmy, who married Fuffy and dated them both, was just fabulously good. It's so awful that all I can say about him is he was fabulously good looking.
That's okay.
I kept going through the pictures with the twins' assistant. Fuffy's assistant is very much around, and I would go through the pictures with him in their archives, and I keep saying, he's so good looking. And, he knew them, so he knew Jimmy, so he would say he was not always impressed, but he was a great photographer in his time, and then he quit the business in the 60s and became a dealer of American art and antiques. He was one of the early ones and incredibly successful, and there's a painting, should I say what the painting is? I feel like I should leave it as a surprise for people. There's a very famous painting in the book that the other husband, who was a great still life photographer, who in his time was known as the father of the American still life photograph, the story is he was walking down the street, maybe with Franny, and he spotted a dealer coming in with this now incredibly famous still life painting. He spotted a dealer walking down the street with this painting under his arm, and he said, "How much?" And it traded for $30? Is that? I forget what I said. So he bought it for $30. It sat in his home for a few years. Franny eventually got it when he died, and got it from the first wife when he died. And now it's the keynote work in a well-known museum. I don't want to say what it is because it's kind of a surprise in the book, but
you can find it. It's in a lovely photograph in the book. So.
And there's a photo of one of the characters in the book sitting underneath it. But
there were also all of these like fabulous magazine people who were like so weird and awesome.
Yeah, like, Tony, she's not a magazine person, but Tony Frisell, who was one of the photographers, is just the photographer that Fuffy worked for, was just such a wonderful character. She was kind of a Park Avenue heiress. She was a doctor's daughter, I think, and she started photographing as an amateur and became this really kind of somewhat technically accomplished, but very daredevil, outdoor kind of photographer, and ended up being the first. She did all of this great war photography. She was the only professional to photograph the Tuskegee Airmen at their base in Italy, and then she became the first woman contributor to Sports Illustrated.
Well, I don't know if you can top that.
She was a daredevil skier. She was just such a wonderful personality.